The crystal chandelier in my attorney's office cast fractured rainbows across the mahogany conference table as I stared at the stack of legal documents that would rewrite the destiny of $200 million. My weathered hands, adorned with the same diamond wedding band I'd worn for 57 years, trembled slightly as I reached for the Mont Blanc pen that would change everything. Attorney Harrison Blackwood cleared his throat nervously, his silver-rimmed glasses reflecting the afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown Chicago office. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mrs. Williams, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years of legal experience. Once you sign these papers, there's no going back. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want to do? I looked up at him, meeting his concerned gaze with eyes that had seen 8 decades of joy, heartbreak, triumph, and betrayal. In that moment, I thought about the phone that had remained silent for 3 weeks now. The empty mailbox, the birthday that had passed without a single call from the 4 children I had raised, loved, and sacrificed everything for. The children who had forgotten that March 15th was the day their mother turned 80 years old. Mr. Blackwood, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside me. I have never been more certain of anything in my entire life. My name is Kimberly Williams, though everyone has called me Kim for as long as I can remember. At 80 years old, I've lived through presidencies that shaped history, watched the world transform from rotary phones to smartphones, and built a fortune that started with nothing more than a food cart in downtown Milwaukee and a dream that refused to die. I was born in 1944 to Grace and Walter Thompson, a seamstress and a factory worker who taught me that love wasn't measured in dollars, but in the sacrifices you made for the people who mattered most. My mother would sit at her Singer sewing machine until her fingers bled, taking in alterations and mending clothes for wealthy families on the other side of town. My father worked double shifts at the steel mill, his hands permanently stained black from the metal dust that would eventually claim his lungs when I was just 23 years old. Growing up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above Murphy's Bakery, I learned early that survival required ingenuity. While other girls my age were playing with dolls, I was helping my mother thread needles and learning the difference between silk and satin. By the time I was 12, I could hem a dress better than most professional tailors, and by 14 I was designing my own patterns and selling them to neighborhood women for 50 cents each. The smell of fresh bread would wake me every morning at 5:30, drifting up through the thin floorboards from the bakery below. Miss Murphy, a kind Irish woman with flour permanently dusted in her graying hair, would sometimes leave day-old pastries outside our door when she knew money was particularly tight. Those small acts of kindness taught me about community, about taking care of those around you, lessons I would carry with me through every triumph and tragedy that followed. When I met Robert Williams at a church social in 1965, I was 21 years old and working 3 jobs to help support my parents while attending night classes in business administration at the local community college. Robert was 24, fresh out of the army, with calloused hands and a smile that could light up a room. He had grown up on a dairy farm 2 hours outside the city, and possessed a work ethic that matched my own. Our first date was a walk through Riverside Park followed by coffee at a diner that served pie for 35 cents a slice. Robert told me about his dreams of opening his own business, something that would give him the freedom to build a life on his own terms. I shared my own aspirations, the secret notebooks filled with business ideas I'd been developing since I was 15. Most young men would have been intimidated by a woman with such ambitious plans, but Robert's eyes lit up with excitement. Kim Thompson, he said, reaching across the diner table to take my hand. I think you and I are going to change the world. We were married 8 months later in a simple ceremony at St. Mark's Catholic Church. My dress was one I had sewn myself using fabric my mother had been saving for years for a special occasion. Robert wore his father's suit, altered to fit his broader shoulder. We couldn't afford a honeymoon, so we spent our wedding night in the small apartment we'd rented above a hardware store, planning our future by candlelight because we hadn't yet saved enough to have the electricity turned on. Our first business venture was born out of necessity rather than grand ambition. Robert had been laid off from his construction job just 3 months after our wedding, and I was pregnant with our first child. With $57 in our bank account and rent due in 2 weeks, we pooled our resources and bought a used hot dog cart from a man who was retiring after 30 years of feeding hungry factory workers. Every morning at 4:30, I would wake up and prepare the food while Robert loaded the cart and planned our route through the industrial district. I was 6 months pregnant, standing on swollen feet for 12 hours a day, but we were building something together. By the time our daughter Rebecca was born in October of 1966, we had saved enough money to buy a second cart and hire our first employee. Rebecca was followed by Michael in 1968, Catherine in 1970. 4 children in 7 years, each one arriving just as our business was reaching a new milestone. The hot dog carts had evolved into 3 food trucks, then a small restaurant, then a catering company that served everyone from construction crews to corporate executives. The early years of parenthood were a beautiful chaos of diaper changes between business meetings, homework help after 14-hour workdays, and family dinners squeezed between the demands of an empire that seemed to grow larger every month. Robert and I tag-teamed everything, one of us always available to drive to soccer practice or help with a school project while the other handled the latest crisis at work. I remember the night we made our first $1 million in annual revenue. It was 1979, and David had just started kindergarten. Robert and I sat at our kitchen table, surrounded by financial statements and calculators, staring at numbers that seemed impossible. We had started with a hot dog cart and $57, and somehow we had built something that employed 43 people and served thousands of customers every week. "What do we do now?" Robert asked, his voice filled with wonder and a touch of fear. "We keep going," I replied, already envisioning the next phase of expansion. "But we never forget where we came from, and we never let this change who we are." Those words would prove to be prophetic in ways I couldn't have imagined. Success has a way of changing people, even when they're determined not to let it. The restaurant became a chain, the catering company became a hospitality empire, and by the time our youngest child graduated from high school, Williams Enterprises was generating revenues that placed us among the wealthiest families in the Midwest. But wealth, I would learn, is a complicated inheritance to leave your children. It can be a blessing or a curse, depending on how they choose to receive it. In the beginning, I believed love and money could coexist peacefully. I thought that providing for my children, ensuring they never experienced the poverty and uncertainty that had shaped my own childhood, was the greatest gift I could give them. Rebecca, our eldest, was always the academic star of the family. Brilliant and driven, she earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University and later Harvard Law School. She specialized in corporate law and quickly became a partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious firms. At 57 years old, she lived in a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, drove a car that cost more than most people's houses, and commanded hourly rates that would have supported a family for months. Michael followed a different path, channeling his creativity into architecture. His designs had transformed skylines in 3 major cities, and his firm employed over 200 people. At 55, he had achieved recognition that most architects only dream of, with buildings that would outlast all of us and a reputation that extended far beyond the Midwest. Catherine chose medicine, becoming a pediatric surgeon who had saved countless children's lives over her 25-year career. Her dedication to her patients was absolute, and her skill in the operating room was legendary among her colleagues. At 53, she was the head of pediatric surgery at one of the nation's top children's hospitals. David, our baby, had always been the entrepreneur of the family. Even as a child, he was constantly scheming up new ways to make money, from selling lemonade to organizing neighborhood car wash. By 50, he had built his own technology company that specialized in logistics software for large corporations. His innovations had revolutionized supply chain management for companies around the world. On paper, we were the perfect American success story. 2 parents who had built an empire from nothing, 4 children who had each achieved remarkable success in their chosen fields, and enough wealth to ensure that future generations would never want for anything. We should have been the family that other families aspired to become. But somewhere along the way, in the pursuit of individual achievement and the accumulation of personal wealth, we had lost something essential. The children who had once gathered around our kitchen table every Sunday for family dinner, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Became adults who scheduled visits to their parents like business appointments. The grandchildren I had dreamed of spoiling became strangers who knew me as the woman who sent expensive gifts on birthdays and holidays, but couldn't tell you their favorite subjects in school or what made them laugh. The first warning sign came when Robert was diagnosed with lung cancer, and despite never smoking a day in his life, the doctors found a mass in his lower right lung that had been growing silently for months. The prognosis was grim, 12 to 18 months if we were lucky, possibly less if the cancer proved aggressive. I expected our children to rally around their father, to put aside their busy schedules and demanding careers, to spend time with the man who had worked himself to exhaustion to provide them with every opportunity they'd ever had. What I got instead were conference calls scheduled around court dates and surgery schedules, quick visits squeezed between business trips, and updates delivered via text message, because phone calls took too much time. Rebecca managed Robert's legal affairs with professional efficiency, ensuring his will was updated and his business interests were properly protected. But she missed his birthday that year because of a case that required her to be in New York, and when she did visit, she spent most of the time on her phone dealing with client emergency. Michael redesigned our home to make it more accessible as Robert's condition deteriorated, installing ramps and widening doorways with thoughtful attention to detail. But his visits became less frequent as his own business demanded more travel, and often, when he was physically present, his mind was clearly elsewhere. Catherine provided medical expertise, helping us navigate treatment options and understand the complex terminology doctors used to describe her father's decline. She arranged for the best specialists and ensured Robert received care that other families could never afford. But she approached his illness like a medical case rather than a personal tragedy, maintaining the professional distance that served her well in the operating room, but left little room for emotional connection. David handled the financial aspects of Robert's care, managing insurance claims and coordinating payments with characteristic efficiency. He made sure we had access to experimental treatments and clinical trials that might extend Robert's life. But he treated his father's cancer like a business problem to be solved rather than a heartbreaking reality to be endured together. They were all present at Robert's funeral in March of 2019, dressed appropriately in expensive black clothing, and speaking the right words to the hundreds of people who came to pay their respect. They delivered eloquent eulogies that captured their father's professional achievements and public contribution, but somehow missed the man who had taught them to ride bicycles and helped them with algebra homework, and attended every school play and sporting event, despite his exhausting work schedule. After the service, after the last casserole had been delivered and the thank you notes had been written, our children returned to their separate lives with what felt like relief. The difficult chapter of their father's illness was closed, and they could focus once again on their own families and careers and ambitions. I was left alone in the house that Robert and I had shared for 43 years, surrounded by memories and silence. For the first time since I was 21 years old, I was truly on my own, trying to figure out who Kim Williams was, when she wasn't half of a partnership that had defined her entire adult life. The first year of widowhood was a masterclass in loneliness. I threw myself into charitable work, serving on the boards of 3 different organizations, and personally overseeing the scholarship program that Robert and I had established for first-generation college students. I traveled, visiting places that Robert and I had always planned to see together but never found the time for, while we were building our empire. I learned to cook for one person after decades of preparing meals for a large family, to sleep alone in a king-sized bed that felt as vast as an ocean, to make decisions without conferring with the partner who had been my sounding board for everything from business strategy to what to watch on television. My children called dutifully, brief conversations every few weeks, that covered the basics of health and weather but rarely ventured into anything deeper. They invited me to holiday gatherings where I felt like an honored guest rather than the matriarch of the family, sitting in chairs that had been carefully selected for my comfort, but somehow made me feel ancient and fragile. The grandchildren, now teenagers and young adults, were polite and respectful but clearly saw me as an obligation rather than a person they were excited to spend time with. They would hug me when prompted by their parents, and answer my questions about school and friends with the kind of vague responses that teenagers give to adults they don't really know. It became clear that my role in their lives was primarily financial. I was the grandmother who could afford to pay for college tuition and wedding expenses, and down payments on houses. I was generous with my money because it was the one gift they seemed genuinely excited to receive, and because I remembered what it felt like to worry about rent and groceries, and whether you could afford to take your child to the doctor. But generosity, I learned, can become its own kind of trap. The more I gave, the more they seemed to expect, and the less they felt obligated to offer anything in return beyond perfunctory gratitude and the promise to use the money wisely. By my 78th birthday in 2022, our family gatherings had become carefully choreographed events where everyone played their assigned roles with professional precision. I was the wealthy matriarch who asked the right questions about careers and relationships, and expressed appropriate pride in everyone's achievements. My children were the successful adults who updated me on their lives and thanked me for my continued support of their family. The grandchildren were the polite young people who demonstrated good manners and shared just enough about their lives to prove they were turning out well. It was all very civilized and pleasant, and completely devoid of the genuine warmth and connection that I remembered from our early years together. We had become strangers who happened to share DNA and financial interests, going through the motions of family love without any of the substance that made it real. Last year, my 79th birthday fell on a Wednesday. Rebecca called that morning from her office, squeezing in a brief conversation between meetings. Michael sent flowers delivered by a service, beautiful but impersonal. Catherine texted her wishes while she was between surgery. David transferred money into my account to treat myself to something special, since he was traveling for business and couldn't visit. Each gesture was thoughtful in its own way, but together they painted a picture of children who saw their mother as another item on their to-do lists, something to be checked off efficiently so they could move on to more pressing concerns. I spent that day alone, eating a birthday cake I had bought for myself and trying to remember when I had become someone whose needs could be satisfied with money and obligation, rather than presence and attention. That night, sitting in the library that Robert and I had designed together, surrounded by books we had collected over 5 decades of marriage, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Harrison Blackwood, the attorney who had handled our family's legal affairs for 20 years, and asked him to schedule a meeting. "I want to update my will," I told him, my voice steady and calm. "I have some significant changes to make." The months that followed were a careful dance of investigation and preparation. I hired a private investigator, a discreet woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in family matters, to document my children's lives in detail. I wanted to understand exactly how they spent their time, what their priorities were, and how much space their mother occupied in their day-to-day existence. The reports that Sarah compiled were thorough and devastating. Rebecca worked an average of 75 hours per week, and had taken exactly 6 vacation days in the past 2 years. Her marriage was struggling under the weight of her professional ambitions, and her teenage daughter had been in therapy for anxiety and depression, related to her mother's chronic absence. Michael's architectural firm was thriving, but his personal life was in chaos. He was having an affair with a young associate, a secret that was slowly destroying his 28-year marriage. His twin sons, now 25, lived across the country and spoke to their father maybe once a month. Catherine's dedication to her patients was admirable, but had come at the cost of her relationship with her own family. Her husband handled all the domestic responsibilities while she worked 60-hour weeks and spent most of her free time reviewing cases and attending medical conferences. Her 3 children, ranging in age from 16 to 22, had learned to manage their emotional needs without their mother's input. David's technology company was facing serious financial difficulties that he was hiding from his family and investors. His marriage had ended in divorce 2 years earlier when his wife discovered he had been lying about the company's finances and their personal debt. His ex-wife had custody of their 2 young children, and David saw them every other weekend when his travel schedule permitted. Reading these reports felt like studying the lives of strangers who happened to share my last name. The children I had raised to value family and connection had become adults who treated relationships like business transactions, measuring success in terms of financial achievement rather than personal fulfillment. But the most revealing information came from the surveillance of their social media accounts and personal communications. Sarah's investigation uncovered a group text thread that included all four of my children but excluded me entirely. The messages revealed conversations about my advancing age, concerns about my mental competency, and detailed discussions about how to manage my estate when I eventually die. They spoke about me like I was already gone, calculating the value of my assets, and debating the most tax-efficient ways to distribute my wealth among their own family. They expressed frustration with my charitable giving, worried that I was giving away their inheritance to organizations and causes that didn't benefit them directly. Most painfully, they discussed my increasing attempts to spend time with them as evidence that I was becoming needy and demanding in my old age. My invitations to family dinners were described as impositions on their busy schedule. My interest in their children's lives was characterized as intrusive meddling. My gifts of time and attention were dismissed as desperate attempts to buy affection from people who had outgrown their need for a mother's love. The final piece of evidence came in the form of a recorded conversation between Rebecca and Michael captured by the investigator during a lunch meeting at an expensive downtown restaurant. They were discussing my upcoming 80th birthday and debating whether they needed to organize any kind of celebration. "She's getting so demanding lately," Rebecca complained, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision. "Last week she called 3 times asking if I wanted to have lunch. I don't have time for lunch with anyone, let alone a lengthy meal where she asks a million questions about work and the kids." "I know what you mean," Michael replied, scrolling through his phone while he talked. "She keeps suggesting family trips and group vacations, like we're still children who need her to organize our social lives. I barely have time to spend with my own wife and kids, much less extended family events. The thing is," Rebecca continued, lowering her voice slightly, "I think we need to be strategic about how we handle her. She's 80 years old, which means we're probably looking at another 5 to 10 years of this, and she controls a fortune that could set up our children and grandchildren for life." Michael nodded, finally looking up from his device. "Exactly. We need to maintain a relationship that keeps us in the will without sacrificing our own lives and careers. A phone call every few weeks, maybe dinner once a month, showing up for the major holidays. That should be enough to keep her happy." "What about her birthday?" Rebecca asked. "She's been dropping hints about wanting to celebrate her 80th with the whole family." "I'm traveling that week," Michael said quickly. "Big client presentation in Seattle. Can't be changed. I have the Morrison trial starting that Monday, so I'll be in prep mode all weekend," Rebecca replied. "Maybe we just send something nice and promise to celebrate when our schedules calm down." They spent the rest of their lunch planning their strategic absence from my milestone birthday, discussing the minimum level of contact required to maintain their inheritance prospects, while avoiding any meaningful investment of time or emotional energy in their relationship with their mother. Listening to that recording, sitting alone in my library with tears streaming down my face, I finally understood the truth about my relationship with my children. I wasn't their beloved mother whose company they cherished, and whose wisdom they valued. I was a financial asset to be managed, a wealthy elderly woman, whose feelings needed to be considered only insofar as they affected her estate planning decision. The love I had been offering them for decades was not only unwanted, it was seen as a burden they had to endure in order to maintain access to my money. My desire to be part of their lives was an inconvenience they strategically managed, rather than a gift they treasured. As March 15th approached, I made one final test of their love. I deliberately mentioned my upcoming birthday in every conversation, not asking for anything elaborate but making it clear that this milestone mattered to me. I talked about how much it would mean to have the family together, how grateful I was for all the blessings in my life, how excited I was to celebrate 8 decades of life with the people I loved most. Each of my children responded with vague promises to try to make something work, and assurances that we would definitely celebrate soon. even if the actual day didn't align with their schedules. I could hear the calculation in their voices, the careful balance between saying enough to keep me placated and avoiding any concrete commitments that might interfere with their plans. On March 14th, the day before my 80th birthday, I sat by my phone waiting for someone to call and confirm the celebration we had all been discussing for weeks. The phone remained silent. I checked my email for messages about dinner reservations or party plans. My inbox contained only spam and charity solicitations. That evening, I called Rebecca's office and was told she was in trial preparation and couldn't be disturbed. I tried Michael's cell phone and got voicemail. Catherine was in surgery, according to her assistant. David's phone went straight to voicemail, suggesting it was turned off entirely. March 15th dawned gray and cold, a typical Chicago morning in early spring. I woke up at 6:30, the same time I had awakened every day for the past 60 years, and lay in bed listening to the silence that surrounded me. No sounds of family preparation downstairs, no smell of birthday breakfast cooking in the kitchen, no excited grandchildren running up the stairs to wish me happy birthday. By 8 o'clock I knew they had forgotten. Not forgotten in the sense that the date had slipped their minds, but forgotten in the sense that their mother's 80th birthday was not important enough to interrupt their regular schedule. They had made a collective decision that my milestone was less significant than their work meetings and business trips and court cases. I spent that day doing exactly what I wanted to do for the first time in decades. I drove to the cemetery where Robert was buried and sat by his grave for an hour, telling him about the children we had raised, and wondering if we had made terrible mistakes in trying to give them everything we had never had. I treated myself to lunch at the little diner where Robert and I had eaten pie on our first date, now updated with modern decor, but still serving the same comfort food that had sustained us through our early years together. I bought myself a beautiful necklace at a jewelry store downtown, something I had been admiring for months, but hesitating to purchase because it seemed frivolous. I ended the day with dinner at the fanciest restaurant in the city, sitting alone at a table for one and ordering the most expensive item on the menu just because I could. The servers were attentive and kind, probably feeling sorry for the elderly woman dining alone on what was obviously a special occasion. When I returned home that evening, my phone showed no missed calls, my email contained no birthday messages, the mailbox held only bills and advertisements. At 9 o'clock, Rebecca sent a brief text message. "Sorry I missed calling today. Crazy day in court. Hope you had a nice birthday. Love you." Michael sent flowers the next morning with a card that said, "Belated birthday wishes. Sorry I was traveling." Catherine called that afternoon and left a voicemail explaining that she had been in emergency surgery all day but wanted to wish me a happy birthday. David sent a generous check with a note promising to take me to dinner soon to celebrate properly. Each gesture was designed to acknowledge their oversight while minimizing their guilt and responsibility. They were sorry they had missed the day, but their absence was justified by circumstances beyond their control. They loved me and wanted to celebrate, but their professional obligations had to take priority. I didn't respond to any of their belated birthday wishes. For the first time in my life as a mother, I simply didn't have the energy to make excuses for their behavior or pretend that their gestures were adequate substitutes for their presence. Instead, I spent the following weeks observing my children's social media accounts, watching them post pictures of business dinners and vacation trips and social events that had apparently been more important than their mother's 80th birthday. I saw Rebecca at a charity gala the night before my birthday, dressed in a gown that cost more than most people earn in a month. I saw Michael's Instagram posts from his business trip to Seattle, including photos of expensive meals and tourist attractions that suggested he had plenty of time for leisure activities, despite his claims of overwhelming work demand. 3 weeks after my forgotten birthday, I called Harrison Blackwood and scheduled the meeting that would change everything. I had finally accepted the truth about my relationship with my children, and it was time to act on that knowledge. The new will I was about to sign would shock them in ways they couldn't imagine. But more importantly, it would free me to spend my remaining years investing my love and resources in people who actually wanted both, rather than continuing to chase the affection of children who saw me only as a source of financial security. As I sat in that conference room, pen in hand, I thought about the woman I had been at 21, full of dreams and determination and faith in the power of love to overcome any obstacle. That woman would never have imagined that her greatest success in business would coincide with her most devastating failure as a mother. But that same woman would also have understood the decision I was about to make. She knew the value of hard work and determination, but she also knew the importance of investing your energy where it would be appreciated and reciprocated. At 80 years old, I was finally ready to stop trying to earn my children's love and start focusing on the relationships that brought joy and meaning to my life. The $200 million that my children assumed would be their inheritance was about to become something far more powerful. A tool for creating the kind of family connection I had always dreamed of, even if that family wasn't the one I had given birth to. Harrison Blackwood cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable with the radical changes we were about to implement. Mrs. Williams, I have to ask one more time. Are you certain you want to proceed with these revisions? Once you sign these documents, your children will inherit nothing more than nominal amounts. The bulk of your estate will go to, well, to people you've only known for a short time. I smiled at him, feeling more confident and at peace than I had in years. Blackwood, I've spent 60 years building wealth for people who don't value my presence in their lives. It's time to invest in people who do. I signed my name with the same confident strokes I had used to sign business contracts for 5 decades. And with that signature, I rewrote not only my will but the entire future of my family legacy. The weeks following my decision to change my will brought an unexpected sense of liberation that I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. For the first time in years, I woke up each morning without the weight of disappointment pressing down on my chest, without the constant ache of trying to connect with people who saw me as an obligation rather than a blessing. I had always been an early riser, a habit formed during those years when Robert and I would start our day at 4:30 to prepare for the food cart business. Even at 80, my internal clock remained faithful to that schedule. But now, instead of lying in bed worrying about whether my children would call or visit, I found myself energized by the possibilities each new day presented. The first major change I made was to my living situation. The sprawling estate that Robert and I had built in Lake Forest felt like a museum of memories that no one else seemed interested in preserving. 12,000 square feet of space designed for entertaining large families and hosting holiday gatherings that had become increasingly forced and infrequent. The formal dining room where we had once shared Sunday dinners now collected dust, and the playroom we had created for grandchildren who visited perhaps twice a year felt like a monument to misplaced hope. I contacted Margaret Chen, a real estate agent who specialized in luxury properties, and put the house on the market. Margaret was a woman about my daughter Catherine's age, but unlike Catherine, she seemed genuinely interested in my stories about the house and the life Robert and I had built there. She asked thoughtful questions about the custom features we had designed and listened with real attention when I explained the reasoning behind certain architectural choices. Mrs. Williams, she said during our initial meeting, walking through the marble-floored foyer that had always intimidated me slightly, this house tells an incredible story. It's clear that every detail was chosen with love and intention. The new owners will be very fortunate. Her genuine appreciation for what Robert and I had created together meant more to me than all the perfunctory compliments my children had ever offered about our home. Margaret saw the beauty in the hand-carved moldings and custom stonework that my own family had taken for granted, walking past these details for years without ever acknowledging the thought and care that had gone into their creation. While the house was being prepared for sale, I began the process of downsizing my possessions, a task that proved both emotionally challenging and surprisingly therapeutic. 60 years of marriage and child-rearing had filled every closet and drawer with items that carried memories, some precious and others simply accumulated through the ordinary passage of time. I started with Robert's belongings, which I had been unable to touch for the 4 years since his death. His closet still held the scent of his cologne, and his dresser drawers contained the watches and cufflinks he had collected over decades of business success. I kept a few items that held special meaning: his wedding ring, the pocket watch his father had given him, a photograph of us dancing at our 25th anniversary party. The rest I donated to organizations that helped men re-entering the workforce, knowing that Robert would have approved of his clothing going to people who needed professional attire but couldn't afford it. The children's bedrooms presented a different kind of challenge. Each room had been preserved exactly as they had left it when they moved out for college, as if I were maintaining shrines to their childhood rather than simply neglecting to update spaces they no longer occupy. Rebecca's room still displayed her high school debate trophies and National Honor Society certificates, Michael's walls were covered with architectural sketches and building models he had constructed as a teenager. Catherine's desk held medical textbooks from her undergraduate years and thank you letters from patients she had helped during hospital volunteer work. David's room showcased his various entrepreneurial ventures, ribbons from science fairs, certificates from business competitions, and prototypes of inventions he had designed before he was old enough to drive. Looking at these monuments to their younger selves, I felt a complicated mixture of pride and sadness. These rooms represented the children I had known and loved, the versions of Rebecca, Michael, Catherine, and David, who had shared their dreams with me and sought my advice on everything from homework to heartbreak. Somewhere along the way, those open, loving children had transformed into the distant, calculating adults who viewed their mother as a financial asset rather than a person worthy of their time and affection. I packed up their belongings carefully, placing items in labeled boxes that I would offer to them if they wanted these mementos of their youth. If they didn't, these artifacts of their childhood would find new homes where they might bring joy to other families. The process felt like conducting a funeral for relationships that had died so gradually I hadn't noticed their passing until it was too late to resuscitate them. The family photographs proved to be the most difficult items to sort through. Our walls had been covered with decades of carefully arranged pictures documenting every milestone and celebration. Christmas mornings with 4 excited children surrounded by wrapping paper and gifts. Graduation ceremonies where Robert and I beamed with pride as each child achieved their latest academic success. Wedding photos where our children looked radiant and hopeful, starting their own families with the same optimism Robert and I had felt 40 years earlier. But as I studied these images more closely, I began to notice patterns I had missed when I was living through these moments. In the more recent photographs, the smiles looked forced and the embraces appeared perfunctory. Family gatherings from the past 10 years showed people going through the motions of connection, without the genuine warmth and spontaneous laughter that characterized our earlier celebrations. There was a particularly telling photograph from David's wedding 5 years earlier. The entire family was arranged in formal poses on the steps of the country club where the reception was held. Everyone looked beautiful and successful, dressed in expensive clothing and jewelry that demonstrated their prosperity. But their eyes held no real joy, and the physical distance between family members was obvious even to a casual observer. We looked like actors portraying a happy family rather than people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. I selected a few dozen photographs that captured genuinely happy moments, mostly from the children's younger years when our connections had been authentic and uncomplicated. The rest I placed in albums that would be offered to my children along with their other belongings. If they wanted to preserve these memories, they were welcome to them. If not, I would no longer feel obligated to maintain a photographic shrine to a family dynamic that no longer existed. The jewelry collection I had accumulated over 6 decades presented its own set of decisions. Robert had been generous with gifts throughout our marriage, marking every anniversary and achievement with pieces that grew more elaborate as our wealth increased. I had earrings and necklaces and bracelets worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, items I had worn to charity galas and business dinners, but rarely enjoyed simply for their beauty. My engagement ring alone was worth more than most people earn in several years, a 5-carat diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught light from across a room. Robert had upgraded it twice during our marriage, replacing my original modest solitaire with increasingly impressive versions as our success allowed for such indulgence. But looking at it now, I realized I preferred the simple band I had worn during our early years together, when love was measured in hours spent together rather than carats displayed on my finger. I kept a few pieces that held genuine sentimental value: my original wedding band, a pearl necklace Robert had given me for our first anniversary, and a pair of diamond earrings he had surprised me with when our first restaurant turned its first profit. The rest would be sold, with the proceeds going to establish scholarship funds for young women starting their own businesses. As the house clearing process continued, I found myself thinking more clearly about what actually mattered to me and what I had been keeping simply out of habit or obligation. The expensive china we had used for holiday dinners held no meaning if there were no longer holiday dinners to host. The formal living room furniture that had cost a fortune meant nothing if the people it was meant to impress no longer visited. During this period of transition, I began spending more time in places where genuine human connection was still possible. The library where I had volunteered for 15 years became my sanctuary, a place where I could interact with people who appreciated my presence and valued my contribution. The children who attended Storytime didn't care about my net worth or inheritance plans. They simply enjoyed the animated voices I used for different characters and the way I remembered their names from week to week. Miss Rodriguez, the head librarian, had become something closer to a friend than many people I had known for decades. She was a woman in her early 60s who had dedicated her career to making books and information accessible to everyone in our community, regardless of their economic circumstance. When she learned I was selling my house, she expressed genuine concern about my well-being. "Mrs. Williams," she said one afternoon as we were organizing the children's section, "I hope you're not making these changes because you're feeling pressured by anyone." Sometimes family members can push elderly relatives to downsize before they're really ready. Her assumption that my children might be encouraging me to sell the house was both touching and ironic. In reality, none of them had any idea I was making such a significant change to my living situation. They were so disconnected from my daily life that I could completely uproot myself without anyone noticing until the moving trucks arrived. "Actually," I told her, carefully placing picture books back on their designated shelves, "this decision is entirely my own. I'm finding that I want to spend my remaining years investing my time and energy in relationships that bring me joy rather than maintaining spaces and possessions for people who don't really want to share them with me." Miss Rodriguez studied my face with the kind of perceptive attention that I hadn't received from my own children in years. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "there's something different about you lately. You seem lighter somehow, more at peace. Whatever changes you're making, they appear to be good for you." Her observation was accurate. The process of releasing myself from obligations that no longer served me was indeed creating a sense of lightness I hadn't felt in years. Each box of belongings I donated, each room I cleared of accumulated possessions, each decision I made, based on my own preferences, rather than other people's expectations, brought me closer to rediscovering who Kim Williams was when she wasn't trying to be the perfect mother, grandmother, and matriarch. The house sold within 3 weeks of being listed, purchased by a young family with 4 children who were clearly excited about the space and possibilities the property offered. When I met them during the final walkthrough, I saw echoes of Robert and myself 40 years earlier, hard-working parents who had achieved success and wanted to create a beautiful home for their children. The father was an entrepreneur who had built a technology company, and the mother was a physician who had recently opened her own practice. Their children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, ran through the rooms with the kind of excitement and wonder that my own grandchildren had never shown during their brief visit. They talked enthusiastically about which bedrooms they wanted to claim and how they might use the various spaces for family activity. Watching them explore the house that Robert and I had built with such hope and intention felt like passing a torch to people who would truly appreciate what they had been given. "Mrs. Williams," the mother said as we concluded the paperwork, "we can tell this house was built with tremendous love. We promise to take good care of it and create wonderful memories here with our family." Her words brought tears to my eyes, not from sadness but from gratitude. These strangers understood and valued what Robert and I had created in a way that our own children never had. Our house would continue to be a home rather than simply becoming another asset in someone's investment portfolio. The condominium I purchased was a dramatic change from the estate I was leaving behind. Located in a full-service building in downtown Chicago, it offered 1,500 square feet of elegantly appointed space with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking Lake Michigan. The building featured a concierge service, a fitness center, and a rooftop garden where residents could gather for informal social events. What appealed to me most about the building was its sense of community. Many of the residents were professionals in their 50s and 60s who had downsized from larger homes, but still valued connection with their neighbor. There were regular coffee hours in the building's common room, book clubs that met monthly, and informal dinner groups that rotated hosting duties among different units. For the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to social interactions rather than dreading them. These new acquaintances had no preconceptions about who I was supposed to be or what I owed them. They were simply interesting people who enjoyed conversation and companionship without the complicated dynamics that had poisoned my relationships with my own family. Eleanor Blackstone, who lived in the unit next to mine, became an unexpected friend during my first month in the building. She was a retired federal judge who had never married or had children, having devoted her career to civil rights law and judicial reform. At 78, she was sharp, funny, and completely comfortable with her choices to prioritize professional achievement over traditional family structure. The advantage of not having children, she told me over coffee one morning as we sat in the building's sunroom, is that I never had to experience the heartbreak of watching them become people I don't particularly like. I've seen too many women my age suffering because their children turned out to be selfish or cruel or simply indifferent to their parents' well-being. Her words resonated with me in ways I hadn't expected. For so many years I had assumed that my problems with my children were unique, that other families maintained the close connections I remembered from their younger years. But Eleanor's observations suggested that my experience might be more common than I had realized, that many parents struggle with the reality that successful child-rearing doesn't guarantee lifelong emotional reward. I loved being a mother when my children were young, I confided to her watching the morning light dance across the lake's surface, but somewhere along the way they stopped needing me as a person and started seeing me only as a resource. I kept giving and giving, hoping to earn back the connection we used to have, but it never worked. Eleanor nodded knowingly. You know what I've observed from 40 years on the bench? People treat you the way you allow them to treat you. If you accept breadcrumbs, that's all they'll ever offer you. But if you demand respect and reciprocity, people either step up to meet your standards or reveal themselves as unworthy of your investment. Her perspective was both challenging and liberating. For so long, I had accepted my children's minimal efforts as the best they could offer, making excuses for their behavior, and lowering my expectations rather than demanding the consideration I deserved. Eleanor was suggesting that I had been complicit in my own mistreatment by failing to establish and maintain appropriate boundaries. The social dynamics in my new building provided daily examples of healthy adult relationships based on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's well-being. During the monthly book club meetings, residents engaged in thoughtful discussions about literature and shared personal insights about the themes and characters we encountered. No one checked their phones during conversations or seemed eager to escape to more important activities. When Harold Peterson, a retired professor who lived on the 7th floor, was hospitalized for emergency gallbladder surgery, the building community rallied around him in ways that touched my heart. Neighbors took turns visiting him in the hospital, bringing meals when he returned home, and checking on his recovery progress. No one questioned whether they had time for these gestures or calculated the minimum effort required to maintain their relationship with Harold. The contrast with my own family's behavior during Robert's illness was stark and painful. These virtual strangers were demonstrating the kind of care and concern that my own children had been unable or unwilling to provide for their dying father. They proved that busy, successful people could still prioritize human connection when they chose to do so. Margaret Sullivan, a retired social worker who organized many of the building's activities, had a particularly interesting perspective on family relationships. During one of our casual conversations, she mentioned that she had 2 adult sons who lived in different states and rarely visited or called. For years I made myself crazy trying to maintain connections with them, she told me as we worked together in the rooftop garden, tending to the tomato plants she had started from seeds. I would call constantly, send care packages, plan elaborate visits that they would cancel at the last minute for work or other obligations. Finally, I realized I was putting more effort into those relationships than they were, and that's not sustainable for anyone. What did you do? I asked, genuinely curious about how she had resolved the situation. I stopped chasing them, she said simply, deadheading wilted flowers with practiced efficiency. I made it clear that I loved them and would always be available if they needed me, but I stopped doing all the work to maintain our relationship. It was painful at first, but eventually I found peace in focusing my energy on people who actually wanted my company. Her story felt like a roadmap for the journey I was beginning. The idea of stepping back from one-sided relationships and allowing other people to demonstrate their level of commitment was both terrifying and appealing. I had spent so many years as the organizer, the planner, the person who made sure family connections were maintained, that I had never tested whether those connections could survive without my constant effort. As autumn progressed and I settled more fully into my new life, I found myself experiencing emotions I hadn't felt in decades. Simple pleasure in my own company, excitement about activities I chose purely for my own enjoyment, and genuine affection for people who valued my presence rather than my bank account. I joined a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I had always wanted to try but never had time for during the busy years of building our business and raising children. The instructor, a woman named Patricia Chen, who was probably in her early 40s, had infinite patience with her students and a gift for helping people discover their creative capabilities. "Miss Williams," she said during my third class, as I struggled to capture the delicate shading on a bowl of fruit, "you have wonderful instincts for color and composition. Have you done any artistic work before?" Her question surprised me. During my marriage and child-rearing years, I had been so focused on practical responsibilities that I had never considered whether I might have artistic talents worth developing. Any creative energy I possessed had been channeled into business problem-solving or organizing family activities, rather than personal expression. "I designed patterns for clothing when I was young," I told her, mixing watercolors on my palette with more confidence than I had felt the previous week. "But that was just to make money for my family. I never thought of it as real art." Patricia smiled encouragingly. "Art doesn't have to be created in a studio to be real. Those pattern designs were absolutely art, and they prepared you for this kind of creative work. You understand how colors and shapes work together, and you're not afraid to experiment." Her validation of my creative abilities felt like discovering a part of myself that had been dormant for 60 years. Each week I looked forward to the quiet focus required for painting and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful simply because I wanted to. The other students in the class, mostly retirees, who had found time for creative pursuits after completing their careers, became a source of friendship and encouragement that I had been missing. During this period of personal rediscovery, my children's absence from my life became even more noticeable, but instead of causing pain, their silence began to feel like freedom. I no longer woke up hoping for phone calls that rarely came or planning activities around their schedules that changed without notice. Instead, I filled my days with activities and relationships that brought me genuine satisfaction. The library volunteering continued to be a source of joy and purpose. In addition to reading to children during story time, I began helping adult learners who were working to improve their literacy skills. Many of these students were immigrants who needed to strengthen their English abilities for employment opportunities, and their gratitude for my assistance was both humbling and energizing. Maria Santos, a woman in her 30s, who had come to the United States from Guatemala 5 years earlier, was working to pass her GED so she could enroll in a nursing program. She cleaned office buildings at night and attended classes during the day, caring for her 2 young children in whatever time remained. Despite her exhausting schedule, she approached each tutoring session with enthusiasm and determination that reminded me of my own younger self. "Miss Williams," she said one afternoon, as we worked through practice reading comprehension exercises, "you are so patient with me. My English is not so good, but you never make me feel stupid or ashamed." Her comment made me realize how much I had missed the experience of being genuinely helpful to someone who appreciated my effort. My children had long since stopped needing my guidance or support, and my offers of assistance were often declined with polite but firm assurances that they could handle their problems independently. Maria's gratitude for my help reminded me that I still had valuable skills and knowledge to offer, even if my own family no longer recognized their work. The holiday season that year brought a test of my new resolve to stop organizing my life around my children's minimal efforts at family connection. In previous years, I had spent weeks planning elaborate Thanksgiving and Christmas celebrations, coordinating schedules among 4 busy families and preparing traditional meals that required days of preparation. These gatherings had become increasingly stressful as my children grew more successful and their time became more precious. Conversations were frequently interrupted by work calls that couldn't wait, and family members often arrived late or left early due to other obligations. The children and grandchildren seemed more interested in the expensive gifts I provided than in spending time together, and the overall atmosphere felt more like a business meeting than a family celebration. This year I made a different choice. When Rebecca called in early November to ask about my Thanksgiving plans, I told her I would not be hosting a family dinner. The silence that followed my announcement was telling. "What do you mean you're not hosting?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of panic that suggested she had never considered the possibility that I might not continue this tradition indefinitely. "I mean, I've made other plans for the holiday," I replied calmly. "I'm sure you and your siblings can organize something among yourselves if you want to get together." The conversation that followed revealed just how much my children had taken my efforts for granted. Rebecca seemed genuinely shocked that I might want to spend the holiday doing something other than cooking for 12 people and managing the complex logistics of accommodating everyone's dietary restrictions and schedule preferences. "But Mom," she said, her voice taking on the slightly wheedling tone she had used as a child when she wanted something, "we always spend Thanksgiving at your house. It's tradition. Traditions only work when everyone involved values them," I replied. "I've been hosting family dinners for 30 years and frankly I'm tired of being the only person who seems to care whether we all get together." The phone calls from my other children followed a predictable pattern. Michael called to ask if I was feeling well, as if my decision to break from tradition must indicate some kind of health crisis. Catherine wanted to know if I was angry about something, assuming that my choice reflected some grievance rather than a simple desire to change my routine. David offered to hire a catering company to handle the meal preparation, missing the point entirely. None of them asked what I actually wanted to do for Thanksgiving or whether there was some way they could contribute to making the holiday more enjoyable for me. Their concern was focused entirely on maintaining the status quo that served their needs, rather than considering whether that arrangement was still working for their mother. Instead of cooking for ungrateful family members, I volunteered to help serve Thanksgiving dinner at a homeless shelter downtown. The experience was more meaningful and satisfying than any family gathering I had hosted in recent years. The people we served were genuinely grateful for the meal and the warm environment we provided, and my fellow volunteers were dedicated individuals who had chosen to spend their holiday helping others rather than focusing solely on their own family. Sister Catherine, the nun who coordinated the shelter's programs, was a woman about my daughter's age who radiated the kind of compassion and wisdom that comes from a lifetime of service to others. As we worked together in the shelter's kitchen preparing plates for hundreds of guests, she shared observations about family relationships that resonated deeply with my own experience. "You know," she said as we carved turkey and arranged portions of stuffing and vegetables, "some of the most lonely people I've met are those who have biological families that don't really see them. Blood relationships don't guarantee love or understanding. Sometimes the families we choose are more supportive than the ones we're born into." Her words captured something I had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. My biological children had become strangers who shared my DNA but not my values or priorities. Meanwhile, the people I had met in my new life, Eleanor, Margaret, Patricia, Maria, were offering me the kind of genuine connection and mutual respect that I had been missing. Christmas brought similar challenges and opportunity. Rather than decorating a house that would host reluctant guests and organizing gift exchanges that felt more like obligation than celebration, I planned a trip to visit Emma Rodriguez, a former student I had tutored who was now teaching elementary school in a small town in New Mexico. Emma had invited me to spend the holidays with her family after learning that I would be alone, an invitation that came with no strings attached, and no expectations beyond the simple pleasure of sharing the season with someone they cared about. Her children, ages 8 and 10, were excited to meet Mrs. Kim, who had helped their mother learn to read English well enough to become a teacher herself. The contrast between this genuine welcome and my own family's dutiful tolerance was profound. Emma's children asked endless questions about my life and experiences, genuinely interested in my stories about building a business and traveling the world. They wanted to help me bake cookies and were thrilled when I offered to read them bedtime stories. Their enthusiasm and affection reminded me of the joy I had once found in my relationships with my own children when they were young and still capable of wonder. Emma's husband, Carlos, was a mechanic who worked long hours to support his family but still made time for the simple pleasures of family life. He taught me to play guitar during the quiet evening hours and shared stories about his own parents, who had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but determination to build better lives for their children. "Mrs. Kim," he said one evening as we sat around their modest Christmas tree, Emma tells us you have children and grandchildren who live far away. It must be hard to be separated from them during the holidays. His assumption that geography was the reason for my solitude was both touching and painful. I didn't have the heart to explain that my children lived within driving distance, but had simply chosen to spend the holidays without me. Instead, I focused on the gratitude I felt for being welcomed into their family celebration. Sometimes I told him, the best families are the ones we find rather than the ones we're born into. You and Emma and your children have given me a Christmas I'll never forget. The weeks I spent in New Mexico reinforced my growing understanding that meaningful relationships were built on mutual affection and respect rather than biological connections or financial obligation. Emma's family treated me as an honored guest, whose presence enhanced their celebration rather than a burden they needed to accommodate. When I returned to Chicago in early January, I felt more confident than ever in my decision to prioritize relationships that brought me joy rather than continuing to chase connections that no longer exist. The new will I had signed was just the beginning of a larger transformation in how I approached my remaining years. My children's absence during the holidays had gone virtually unnoticed by me, a stark contrast to previous years when their minimal participation had been a source of constant disappointment. I was finally learning to stop expecting emotional sustenance from people who had repeatedly demonstrated their inability or unwillingness to provide it. The freedom that came with releasing those expectations was intoxicating. For the first time in decades, I was living my life according to my own preferences and values, rather than organizing everything around other people's needs and schedule. The woman who had once defined herself primarily as a wife, mother, and grandmother was discovering that Kim Williams had interests, talents, and desires that extended far beyond those traditional roles. As winter turned toward spring, I found myself making plans that would have been impossible when I was still trying to maintain connections with my absent children. I enrolled in a Spanish language class, partly because I wanted to communicate better with Maria and some of my other tutoring students, and partly because I had always regretted not learning a second language. The instructor, Professor Martinez, was a retired high school teacher who had developed a program specifically for older adults who wanted to learn Spanish for travel or personal enrichment rather than academic credit. His teaching style was patient and encouraging, and the other students in the class became a source of friendship and mutual support as we struggled together with grammar and pronunciation. Senora Williams, he said after I had been attending classes for several weeks, you have a natural ear for the language. Have you considered planning a trip to a Spanish-speaking country to practice your skills in real conversation? His suggestion sparked an idea that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. I began researching volunteer opportunities in Central and South America, programs that would allow me to use my business experience and English language skills to help local communities while improving my Spanish ability. The possibility of international travel for purposes beyond sightseeing represented a fundamental shift in how I viewed my remaining years. Instead of waiting for my children to include me in their lives, or limiting myself to activities that wouldn't interfere with family obligations that no longer existed, I was beginning to plan adventures based solely on my own interests and desires. The woman who had spent 60 years accommodating other people's schedules and preferences was finally ready to discover what Kim Williams wanted to do with the rest of her life. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, the possibilities felt limitless, rather than constrained by other people's expectations and demands. The first sign that something was shifting in my children's behavior came in late February, almost a year after my forgotten 80th birthday. Rebecca called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was attending my watercolor class, leaving a voicemail that was longer and more personal than any communication I had received from her in months. "Hi, Mom," her recorded voice said, with a warmth that seemed forced but was nonetheless more effort than she usually expended. "I was just thinking about you and wanted to check in. I know I've been terrible about staying in touch lately, but work has been absolutely insane. I'm hoping we can get together for lunch soon, maybe this weekend. Call me back when you get a chance. Love you." The message puzzled me because it arrived without any preceding conversation or apparent catalyst. Rebecca typically called only when she needed something specific or when guilt compelled her to fulfill what she saw as her filial obligation. A spontaneous expression of desire to spend time together was entirely out of character for the daughter who had been too busy to acknowledge my milestone birthday. When I returned her call that evening, Rebecca's enthusiasm for our potential lunch date seemed genuine but oddly intense. She suggested several expensive restaurants downtown and offered to clear her schedule to accommodate whatever time worked best for me. The level of accommodation she was proposing represented a complete reversal from her usual pattern of squeezing family interactions into narrow windows between more important commitments. "Actually, Rebecca," I said, testing her newfound flexibility, "I'd prefer somewhere quieter where we can actually have a conversation. Maybe that little bistro near the Art Institute, the one with the lovely garden patio." The suggestion clearly wasn't what she had expected. Rebecca paused for several seconds before responding, and I could almost hear her mental calculations about whether this humble venue would serve whatever purpose she had in mind for our meeting. "Of course, Mom," she finally said, her voice maintaining its artificially bright tone. "That sounds perfect. I'll make a reservation for Saturday at noon." Our lunch meeting revealed the reason behind Rebecca's sudden interest in maternal bonding. After ordering salads and making awkward small talk about the unusually warm weather for February, she launched into what was clearly a prepared presentation about her concerns for my well-being. "Mom," she began, leaning forward across the small table with an expression of practiced sincerity, "I've been worried about you living alone in that new apartment. Don't you think it might be too isolating after all those years in the house? I know the building has amenities, but it's not the same as having family nearby who can check on you regularly." Her concern for my isolation would have been touching if it hadn't been so transparently disingenuous. Rebecca lived 20 minutes away but had visited my apartment exactly once since I had moved there 6 months earlier, and that brief visit had been motivated by her need to retrieve some childhood belongings I had offered to return to her. "I'm actually finding the apartment quite social," I replied, cutting my salad into precise bites while watching her face carefully. "There are book clubs and dinner groups, and I've made several new friends among the other residents. I'm probably more connected to people now than I've been in years." Rebecca's expression shifted slightly, suggesting that my contentment with my new living situation wasn't the response she had hoped to elicit. She tried a different approach, expressing concern about my financial security and questioning whether I had adequate support for managing my investments and estate planning. "I know Dad always handled most of the financial decisions," she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she typically used with difficult clients. "And at your age, it's normal to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of managing significant assets. I'd be happy to review your portfolio and make sure everything is structured properly for tax efficiency and long-term security." The irony of her offer was almost amusing. Rebecca was proposing to help manage the wealth that she assumed would eventually belong to her, positioning herself as my protector while simultaneously ensuring her access to information about my financial situation. Her concern for my welfare was indistinguishable from her concern for her inheritance. "Thank you for the offer," I said calmly, "but I'm very comfortable with my current financial advisor. Harrison Blackwood has been handling our family's legal affairs for 20 years, and Margaret Chen at First National has been excellent with investment management. I'm actually more involved in financial decisions now than I was when your father was alive." Rebecca's frustration with my polite deflection was barely concealed. She spent the remainder of our lunch probing for information about my daily activities, my health status, and my long-term plan. Each question seemed designed to identify vulnerabilities she could exploit or problems she could solve, positioning herself as an indispensable part of my support system. When she offered to help me organize my important documents and ensure my estate planning was current, I realized she was fishing for details about my will and inheritance arrangements. The timing of her sudden attention made sense when viewed through this lens. Perhaps she had noticed that I hadn't been available for holiday gatherings or family events and was concerned that my disengagement might affect her financial prospects. "Mom," she said as we prepared to leave the restaurant, "I hope you know that Michael and Catherine and David and I all care about you deeply. We may not always do a great job of showing it, because we're so caught up in our own responsibilities, but you're incredibly important to all of us." Her declaration of family devotion might have moved me, if it hadn't been delivered with the calculated precision of a closing argument designed to convince a skeptical jury. Rebecca was clearly working from a script, hitting emotional notes that she believed would resonate with a lonely elderly woman who needed reassurance about her children's love. "I appreciate that, Rebecca," I replied, gathering my purse and coat. "Though I have to say, Actions speak louder than words. If I'm truly important to all of you, I'm sure that will become evident through your choices and behavior rather than your declarations. The lunch with Rebecca was followed by a similar outreach effort from Michael, who called the following week to invite me to dinner at his house. This invitation was even more surprising than Rebecca's lunch proposal because Michael rarely entertained at home, preferring to meet people at restaurants where he could control the duration and intensity of social interactions. "Sarah's been asking about you," he said, referring to his wife with whom I had always maintained a cordial but distant relationship. "She wants to cook for you, and the boys would love to see their grandmother. We haven't done enough family dinners lately." The suggestion that Sarah had been asking about me was almost certainly fabricated. Sarah was a pleasant woman who had always been polite to me, but she had never shown any particular interest in developing a closer relationship. She typically spent family gatherings making conversation with the other daughters-in-law while I entertained the grandchildren or helped with meal preparation. Nevertheless, I accepted Michael's invitation because I was curious about what had prompted this sudden desire for family connection. The dinner was scheduled for the following Saturday, giving Sarah plenty of time to prepare what Michael promised would be my favorite meal. The evening at Michael's house revealed the same underlying agenda that had motivated Rebecca's lunch invitation. The conversation repeatedly turned to my living situation, my health, and my need for family support. Michael and Sarah asked detailed questions about my daily routine and expressed concern about my safety living alone in a downtown building. "Mom," Michael said as we finished dessert in his beautifully appointed dining room, "we've been thinking that maybe you'd be happier in a senior living community where there are people your own age and medical support available if you need it. Some of these places are really luxurious now, more like resorts than nursing homes." The suggestion that I needed supervised living was both insulting and revealing. At 80 years old, I was in excellent health, mentally sharp and completely capable of managing my own affairs. The only reason my children would be pushing for me to enter a senior community was to gain greater control over my daily life and financial decisions. "I'm quite happy where I am," I replied firmly. "My building has excellent security and concierge services. I have wonderful neighbors who look out for each other, and I'm close to all the cultural activities downtown that I enjoy. I can't imagine why I would want to leave." Sarah, who had been largely silent during this conversation, suddenly spoke up with what was clearly a prepared comment. "Mrs. Williams, we just worry about you being isolated from family. It would be such a comfort to know that someone was checking on you every day and that you had built-in social activity." Her concern for my isolation was particularly ironic, given that she and Michael lived 15 minutes away, but had invited me to their home exactly twice in the past 3 years. The social activities she was worried about me missing were apparently the ones she had no intention of providing herself. The dinner conversation revealed that my children had been discussing my situation among themselves, coordinating their approach to what they clearly saw as the problem of my independence. Their sudden interest in my welfare was not motivated by genuine concern for my happiness, but by anxiety about their ability to monitor and influence my decisions. Catherine's outreach effort came in the form of an invitation to accompany her to a medical conference, where she was presenting a paper on pediatric surgical techniques. She suggested that I might enjoy the trip to San Francisco and the opportunity to see her professional accomplishments firsthand. "I know you've always been interested in medicine," she said during her phone call, "and I thought it might be fun for us to spend some time together outside of the usual family gathering context. We could do some sightseeing, and maybe visit some of the wineries in Napa Valley." Catherine's invitation was the most sophisticated of my children's recent overtures, because it acknowledged my interests and offered experiences I might genuinely enjoy. The medical conference would indeed be fascinating, and I had always wanted to explore the California wine country. Her approach demonstrated more thoughtful consideration of my preferences than the clumsy attempts at manipulation I had received from Rebecca and Michael. However, the underlying agenda became apparent during our first day in San Francisco. Between conference sessions, Catherine repeatedly steered our conversations toward topics related to aging, medical care, and end-of-life planning. She shared stories about elderly patients whose families had struggled with difficult decisions about medical treatment and financial management. "You know, Mom," she said as we walked through Golden Gate Park, I see so many families in my practice who wish they had started planning earlier for their elderly relatives' care needs. It's much easier to make good decisions when everyone involved is still healthy and mentally sharp. Her clinical approach to family planning was characteristic of Catherine's professional mindset, but it was also clearly designed to encourage me to involve my children in decisions about my future care and financial arrangement. She was positioning herself as the medical expert who could guide our family through the complex decisions that elderly people inevitably face. The weekend in San Francisco was pleasant, despite Catherine's transparent agenda. We did visit wineries in Napa Valley where I discovered an appreciation for Pinot Noir that I had never developed during my marriage to Robert, who preferred bourbon and beer to wine. We toured art museums and enjoyed excellent restaurants, and Catherine made an effort to engage with me as a person rather than simply a patient or mother figure. However, her attempts to gather information about my health status and medical care arrangements were persistent and increasingly intrusive. She wanted to know details about my physicians, my prescription medications, and my preferences for future medical treatment. When I declined to share this information, explaining that I was perfectly capable of managing my own healthcare decisions, she expressed concern about my privacy and reluctance to involve family in important planning. "Mom," she said during our last dinner together, "I know you value your independence, but there may come a time when you need family support for medical decisions. It would be helpful if we had some idea of your preferences and priorities, so we could advocate for you effectively." Her request for information about my medical preferences might have seemed reasonable if it hadn't been part of a coordinated campaign by all my children to gain greater access to my personal affairs. The timing of their simultaneous interest in my well-being was too convenient to be coincidental. David's approach was characteristically direct and business-focused. He called to schedule a meeting at his office, explaining that he wanted to discuss some investment opportunities that might be perfect for someone in my financial position. His invitation came with specific time slots and agenda items, as if I were a potential client rather than his mother. "I've been developing some strategies for high-net-worth individuals who want to maximize their legacy planning while minimizing tax exposure," he said during our phone conversation. "I think you'd find the possibilities really exciting, and it would give us a chance to spend some time together discussing your long-term financial goals." David's office was located in a gleaming downtown tower that housed several technology companies and financial services. The space was decorated with expensive modern art and furnished with the kind of minimalist aesthetic that suggested serious business conducted by serious people. His assistant offered me coffee in bone china cups and ensured I was comfortable in the leather chair positioned across from David's imposing desk. The presentation David delivered was professionally polished and clearly designed to impress me with his expertise and success. He used charts and graphs to demonstrate various investment strategies and tax planning mechanisms that could optimize my estate for maximum benefit to my heir. His proposals involved complex trusts and foundation structures that would require ongoing management by someone with specialized knowledge. "The beauty of these arrangements," he explained, pointing to a flowchart that illustrated money moving between various entities, "is that they protect your assets from taxation while ensuring that your beneficiaries receive maximum value. Of course, you'd need someone you trust to serve as trustee and oversee the ongoing management of these structures." The implicit suggestion that he could serve as the trustee of my financial arrangements was delivered with such smooth professionalism that it almost masked the self-serving nature of his proposal. David was offering to help me structure my estate in ways that would benefit my children while simultaneously positioning himself as the person who would control those benefits. When I asked questions about the fees associated with these complex arrangements and the level of control I would retain over my own assets, David's answers became evasive and filled with technical jargon designed to discourage further inquiry. The structures he was proposing would effectively transfer control of my wealth to professional managers, while limiting my ability to make changes based on my own evolving priority. "David," I said, interrupting his explanation of tax advantages that seemed to benefit everyone except me, "these arrangements all seem designed to benefit my heirs rather than me. What if my priorities change? What if I decide I want to use my money differently than I'm planning now?" His response revealed the fundamental problem with his approach. David had designed these strategies based on the assumption that my primary goal was maximizing my children's inheritance, rather than funding my own remaining years according to my own values and interests. "Well, Mom," he said, looking slightly uncomfortable for the first time during our meeting, "obviously you want to leave as much as possible to your family. These structures ensure that your legacy will support your children and grandchildren for generations to come." His assumption that I would naturally prioritize his financial security over my own autonomy was both revealing and offensive. David had spent our entire meeting trying to convince me to surrender control of my assets, in exchange for the promise that my money would be efficiently transferred to people who had demonstrated minimal interest in my emotional well-being. The coordinated nature of my children's recent attention became undeniable when I compared the timing and content of their various outreach efforts. Within 6 weeks, all 4 of them had initiated contact with me, each focusing on different aspects of what they clearly saw as my need for greater family oversight and support. Rebecca had concentrated on legal and estate planning issues, positioning herself as the attorney who could ensure my affairs were properly managed. Michael had focused on my living situation and safety concerns, presenting himself as the architect who could design better solutions for my housing needs. Catherine had approached the conversation from a medical perspective, emphasizing the importance of family involvement in healthcare decisions. David had tackled the financial aspects, proposing himself as the investment expert who could optimize my wealth management. Together, their individual proposals would have effectively transferred control of every important aspect of my life to my children while maintaining the illusion that these changes were being made for my benefit rather than theirs. They had developed a comprehensive strategy for managing their elderly mother without ever consulting me about whether I wanted or needed their management. The realization that my children were actively plotting to take control of my life and assets was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Their recent expressions of love and concern were revealed as calculated manipulations designed to serve their own interest rather than mine. They weren't worried about my welfare, they were worried about their inheritance and their ability to influence my decisions about how that inheritance would be distributed. During this period of increased attention from my children, I began documenting their behavior and statements with the same care I had once applied to business negotiation. I kept detailed notes about our conversations, saved voicemails and text messages, and maintained records of their visits and proposals. The pattern that emerged was damning in its consistency and transparency. None of my children had expressed any interest in my emotional needs or personal happiness. Their questions focused exclusively on practical concerns that would affect their own futures: my health status, my living arrangements, my financial decisions, and my estate planning priority. They treated me like a business asset that required management, rather than a person who deserved love and respect. The contrast between their recent behavior and the genuine relationships I had developed over the past year was stark and illuminating. Eleanor, Margaret, Patricia, Maria, and my other new friends asked about my feelings, my interests, my dreams for the future. They wanted to know what made me happy and how they could contribute to my well-being. They valued my company for its own sake rather than seeing me as a means to an end. My children, on the other hand, approached me like a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be maximized. Their love was conditional on my compliance with their expectations and my willingness to prioritize their needs over my own preference. They had reduced me to my financial value and my usefulness as a source of inheritance. The most painful aspect of this realization was understanding how long this dynamic had probably been operating without my recognition. Looking back over the years since Robert's death, I could see patterns of behavior that I had misinterpreted as genuine concern but that were actually strategic positioning for eventual inheritance benefit. Their limited visits during Robert's illness now seemed less like busy schedules and more like calculated distance from a situation that was emotionally demanding but financially irrelevant. Their perfunctory participation in family gatherings appeared less like dutiful attendance and more like maintaining minimum viable presence to preserve their inheritance prospects. Even their response to my forgotten 80th birthday took on new meaning when viewed through this lens. They hadn't simply been too busy to remember or celebrate. They had collectively decided that their mother's milestone wasn't worth disrupting their own priorities. The birthday they forgot was the birthday of someone whose primary value to them was financial rather than personal. This understanding crystallized my resolve to proceed with the will changes I had already initiated. My children had revealed themselves to be people who saw me as a resource rather than a person, and I had no obligation to reward that perspective with the inheritance they were already counting on. The final confirmation of their true priorities came during a family dinner that Rebecca organized in March, just over a year after my forgotten birthday. She had convinced all her siblings to attend what she described as a celebration of family that would demonstrate their commitment to maintaining closer relationships going forward. The dinner was held at an expensive downtown restaurant, the kind of place my children typically chose for business meetings rather than family gatherings. The conversation followed a predictable pattern, with each of my children taking turns to express their love for me and their desire to be more involved in my life. But as the evening progressed, their true agenda became increasingly apparent. They had clearly coordinated their approach and were working together to pressure me into accepting their various proposals for managing my affairs. Rebecca mentioned the importance of updating my estate planning documents. Michael suggested that I consider their input on my living arrangement. Catherine emphasized the value of family involvement in medical decisions. David repeated his proposals for optimizing my financial structure. The most revealing moment came when David directly asked about my current will and whether it reflected my latest thinking about how to best provide for my family's future. His question was phrased as concern for my peace of mind, but it was clearly an attempt to gather intelligence about their inheritance prospects. "I'm curious, Mom," he said, leaning back in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who believed his financial security was assured. "When was the last time you reviewed your estate planning? A lot has changed since Dad died, and I want to make sure your wishes are properly documented." The assumption underlying his question was that my wishes would naturally align with his financial interests and those of his siblings. David couldn't conceive of the possibility that I might want to distribute my wealth in ways that didn't prioritize my children's comfort and security. "My estate planning is current and reflects my priorities," I replied calmly. "I review it regularly with my attorney and make updates whenever my thinking evolves about how I want my assets used." The slight tension that rippled through the group when I mentioned evolving thinking was almost palpable. My children exchanged glances that suggested they were concerned about the possibility that their inheritance might not be as secure as they had assumed. Rebecca, always the lawyer, tried to probe more directly. "Of course, Mom, but it might be helpful for us to understand your general philosophy about legacy planning. Are you prioritizing family security, charitable giving, or some combination of both?" Her question was designed to elicit information about how much of my estate would go to charity versus family members, a concern that had apparently been weighing on all of them. The possibility that I might leave significant portions of my wealth to organizations rather than relatives was clearly causing anxiety. "My philosophy," I said, meeting each of their eyes in turn, "is that money should go to people and causes that align with my values and priorities. I believe in rewarding loyalty, kindness, and genuine care for others. I want my resources to support people who make the world better rather than simply people who happen to share my DNA." The silence that followed my statement was heavy with implications that none of them wanted to confront directly. I had essentially told them that their inheritance would depend on their behavior and values, rather than their biological relationship to me. For children who had been counting on genetic entitlement to guarantee their financial future, this was a disturbing development. Michael attempted to lighten the mood by suggesting that family and values naturally aligned, that their love for me demonstrated the kind of care I valued most. But his argument was undermined by the very gathering we were attending, a forced demonstration of affection, organized specifically to influence my estate planning decisions. "You know we all love you, Mom," he said, reaching across the table to pat my hand with awkward affection. "We may not always show it perfectly, but you're the most important person in all our lives." His declaration might have been touching if it hadn't been delivered as part of a calculated campaign to secure his inheritance. The love he was professing had been notably absent during the past year when I had needed emotional support and companionship rather than strategic manipulation. The dinner ended with renewed promises from all my children to be more attentive and involved in my life going forward. They committed to regular family gatherings, more frequent communication, and greater consideration for my needs and preferences. Each promise was delivered with apparent sincerity and accompanied by expressions of regret for their past neglect. But I recognized their commitments as insurance policies, rather than genuine intentions. They were promising to provide just enough attention and affection to maintain their inheritance prospects, without actually investing in a real relationship with me. Their love was being offered as a transaction rather than a gift. As I rode home from that dinner in the taxi I had insisted on taking despite multiple offers of rides from my children, I felt a profound sense of sadness mixed with relief. Sad because I finally understood that the loving relationships I remembered from their childhood were truly gone, replaced by calculated interactions based on financial expectation. Relieved because I no longer had to wonder whether I was imagining their indifference or being too demanding in my expectations of family connection. The children who had once run to greet me when I came home from work, who had shared their secrets and sought my advice, who had made me feel like the most important person in their world, had become adults who saw me primarily as an obstacle to their financial independence. They were capable of performing affection when it served their purposes, but they were no longer capable of offering authentic love without considering what they might receive in return. This understanding freed me to move forward with my estate planning decisions, without guilt or second-guessing. My children had chosen to treat me as an asset rather than a person, and I was under no obligation to reward that choice with the inheritance they assumed was their birthright. The new will I had signed months earlier would soon become the most important document in all their lives, though they had no idea how dramatically it would differ from their expectations. Their recent campaign to secure their inheritance had actually confirmed the wisdom of my decision to leave my wealth to people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I owned. The truth about my children's coordinated campaign to secure their inheritance came crashing down on me in the most unexpected way. It was a warm Tuesday morning in April when Eleanor knocked on my apartment door, holding a manila envelope with an expression of concern that immediately told me something significant had happened. "Kim," she said as I invited her in for coffee, "I'm not sure how to tell you this, but I think you need to see something. My nephew works at Morrison Associates downtown, and he overheard a conversation yesterday that I believe involves your family." Eleanor's nephew, James, was a paralegal at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, the same firm where Rebecca had built her reputation as a corporate attorney. The story he had shared with his aunt would forever change how I viewed not only my children's recent behavior but also their long-term intentions regarding my life and wealth. According to James, he had been working late on Monday evening when he heard familiar voices coming from the conference room adjacent to his cubicle. Through the thin walls he could clearly make out Rebecca's voice along with three others that he didn't recognize but assumed were her siblings, based on the intimate nature of their conversation. "We need to move faster," Rebecca's voice had carried clearly through the wall. "She's 81 years old, and every month that passes is another month she could make decisions that affect our inheritance. The fact that she moved out of the house and into that apartment shows she's already thinking about downsizing and simplifying her life." A male voice that James presumed was Michael responded with obvious frustration. "I tried the housing angle, suggesting she needed supervised care, but she shut me down completely. She's too independent for her own good. We need a different approach." Another female voice, presumably Catherine, joined the conversation with clinical precision. "From a medical standpoint, we could argue that anyone over 80 should have family involvement in major financial decisions. There are precedents for conservatorship when elderly people are making choices that seem contrary to their best interests." The word conservatorship hit me like a physical blow when Eleanor repeated, "My children weren't just plotting to influence my estate planning decisions. They were discussing the possibility of legally removing my right to make my own financial choices. They were considering having me declared incompetent so they could take control of my assets while I was still alive. But she's not showing any signs of cognitive decline," the fourth voice, presumably David, had protested. She's sharp as ever, managing her own affairs, making rational decisions. No court would grant a conservatorship just because we don't like her choices. Rebecca's response revealed the depth of their planning and the coldness of their calculations. We don't need to prove she's incompetent. We just need to create enough doubt about her judgment to warrant family oversight. The apartment move could be characterized as impulsive. Her withdrawal from family activities could suggest depression or social isolation. Her increased charitable giving could be framed as financial recklessness. The conversation that James overheard continued for nearly an hour, with my children systematically analyzing my behavior and identifying ways to construct a narrative that would support their need to intervene in my financial affairs. They discussed hiring private investigators to document my daily activities, consulting with geriatric psychiatrists who might testify about age-related decision-making capacity, and researching legal precedents for family members who had successfully challenged their elderly relatives' financial independence. Most chilling was their discussion of my social life and new friendship. Catherine had apparently been disturbed by my mention of Eleanor and my other neighbors, viewing these relationships as evidence that I was vulnerable to manipulation by people who might influence my estate planning decision. She's forming attachments to strangers, Catherine had said with the same tone she might use to describe a concerning medical symptom. Elderly people can become susceptible to undue influence when they're isolated from family. These new friends could be positioning themselves to benefit from her generosity. As Eleanor finished recounting what her nephew had overheard, I felt a mixture of rage and heartbreak that was unlike anything I had experienced since Robert's death. The children I had raised and loved and sacrificed for were not only plotting to steal my independence, but doing so with cold, calculating precision that suggested they had been planning this betrayal for months. "Kim," Eleanor said softly, reaching across my kitchen table to squeeze my hand. "I'm so sorry to be the bearer of this news, but James felt you needed to know what they were planning. He said he's never heard anything so cold and calculating in 15 years of working at that firm." The information Eleanor provided explained everything about my children's recent behavior, their sudden interest in my welfare, their coordinated outreach efforts, their questions about my health and living situation, their attempts to gather information about my financial affairs. All of it had been research for a legal challenge to my competency and independence. But beneath my heartbreak was a fierce determination to protect myself from their machinations. The new will I had already signed was just the beginning of the steps I would need to take to ensure my children's betrayal would not succeed. If they wanted to wage war against my independence, they would discover that Kim Williams was not the vulnerable elderly woman they assumed me to be. That afternoon I called Harrison Blackwood and arranged to meet him the next morning. When I arrived at his office, I brought with me a detailed plan that would not only protect me from my children's schemes, but also demonstrate the consequences of their betrayal in the most dramatic way possible. "Harrison," I said, settling into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, "I need to make one final addition to my new will. I want to leave each of my children exactly $1 with a specific explanation for why they're receiving so little." His eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "Mrs. Williams, are you certain you want to take such a dramatic step? Once this will is executed and becomes public after your death, there will be no opportunity for reconciliation with your children." "There's already no opportunity for reconciliation," I replied firmly. "They've made it clear that they see me as an obstacle to their financial security rather than a person deserving of love and respect. I want my final act as their mother to teach them a lesson they'll never forget." Harrison opened a fresh legal pad and prepared to take notes. "What specific language would you like to include regarding their minimal inheritance?" I had spent sleepless nights crafting the words that would explain my decision to disinherit the children I had once loved more than life itself. The statement I dictated to Harrison that morning was the product of months of pain, disappointment, and careful consideration. "To my daughter Rebecca Williams Morrison," I began, "I leave the sum of $1. Rebecca is a brilliant attorney who has built a successful career by understanding the law and using it to protect her client's interest. Unfortunately, she has chosen to use those same skills to plot against her elderly mother's independence and autonomy. She has researched conservatorship laws, not to protect me but to control me, and she has treated my love as a liability rather than a gift. I hope that someday she will understand that legal victory means nothing without moral integrity. I continued with similar explanations for each of my other children, detailing their specific betrayals and the ways they had demonstrated that their inheritance was more important to them than my wealth. For Michael, I noted his attempts to undermine my living situation and characterize my independence as evidence of poor judgment. For Catherine, I described her willingness to use her medical expertise to question my competency for financial rather than health-related reasons. For David, I explained how his unauthorized investigation of my financial affairs had violated my privacy and trust. The bulk of my estate, I continued, will be distributed among people and organizations that have demonstrated genuine care for my welfare without expecting financial compensation in return. I had already identified the primary beneficiaries of my revised will. Eleanor Blackstone would receive $5 million in recognition of her friendship and the kindness she had shown me during the most difficult period of my life. Maria Santos, my former tutoring student, would receive enough money to complete her nursing education and buy a home for her family. Patricia Chen, my art instructor, would receive funding to establish a community art program for elderly adults. The library where I had volunteered would receive $10 million to expand their literacy programs. The largest portion of my estate, however, would go to establishing the Robert and Kimberly Williams Foundation for Family Reconciliation, an organization dedicated to helping elderly people navigate difficult relationships with adult children and providing resources for families struggling with inheritance-related conflict. I want my money to go toward solving the kinds of problems my children created rather than rewarding the people who created them, I explained to Harrison, as he carefully documented my wishes. The foundation would provide counseling services for families dealing with elder abuse or financial exploitation, legal assistance for elderly people whose children were attempting to gain inappropriate control over their affairs, and educational programs about healthy family relationships that prioritized love over money. This foundation will be my true legacy, I told Harrison. Instead of enabling my children's greed, my wealth will be used to protect other elderly people from experiencing the betrayal I've endured. The completion of my new will brought a sense of peace and closure that I hadn't expected. For the first time since learning about my children's plotting, I felt like I had regained control of my life and my legacy. They had assumed my love for them would prevent me from taking decisive action against their betrayal, but they had fundamentally misunderstood who Kim Williams was and what she was capable of when pushed too far. The next few weeks passed quietly as I waited to see whether my children would follow through on their plans to challenge my competence. I continued my normal activities, volunteering at the library, attending art classes, spending time with Eleanor and my other friends, while documenting everything to demonstrate my continued mental sharpness and emotional stability. The confrontation I had been expecting came on a Thursday morning in early May when all 4 of my children arrived at my apartment unannounced. Rebecca carried a briefcase filled with legal documents. Michael had a folder of photographs showing my building and surrounding neighborhood. Catherine brought medical literature about age-related cognitive decline, and David had printouts of my financial transactions from the past year. "Mom," Rebecca said as I reluctantly invited them into my living room, "we need to have a serious conversation about your welfare and safety. We've all been concerned about some of the decisions you've been making, and we think it's time for the family to become more involved in helping you manage your affairs." Their coordinated presentation was exactly what James had overheard them planning weeks early. Each child took turns expressing their specific concerns while building toward the conclusion that I needed family oversight to protect me from my own poor judgment. Rebecca focused on legal and financial issues, suggesting that my charitable giving and investment choices demonstrated a concerning pattern of financial recklessness. Michael criticized my living situation and social relationships, arguing that I was isolated from family and vulnerable to manipulation by strangers. Catherine raised medical concerns about age-related cognitive changes that might be affecting my decision-making ability. David presented detailed analyses of my spending patterns that he characterized as evidence of declining financial acumen. The bottom line, Rebecca concluded, is that we love you too much to stand by and watch you make decisions that could compromise your security and independence. We want to work with you to establish some family oversight that will protect you while still respecting your autonomy. Their use of the word autonomy was particularly galling because their entire presentation was designed to eliminate my autonomy while making it seem like they were protecting it. They were offering me the illusion of independence in exchange for surrendering actual control over my life and finances. And what happens if I refuse your offer of family oversight? I asked, meeting each of their eyes in turn. The silence that followed my question revealed everything I needed to know about their true intentions. They had clearly discussed this possibility and prepared a response, but none of them wanted to be the first to articulate the threat they were prepared to make. Finally, Catherine spoke with the clinical detachment she used when delivering difficult medical news to patients' families. "Mom, if you're not willing to work with us voluntarily, we may have no choice but to explore legal options that would ensure your protection." Sometimes families have to make difficult decisions when an elderly relative is unable to recognize that they need help. Her euphemistic language couldn't disguise the fact that she was threatening to have me declared incompetent and placed under conservatorship if I refused to surrender control of my affairs voluntarily. My children were giving me a choice between voluntary submission and legal coercion, neither of which represented genuine respect for my autonomy or judgment. "I see," I said calmly, standing up from my chair and walking to the window that overlooked Lake Michigan. "So my options are to accept your oversight willingly or have it imposed on me through the courts. Those are interesting alternatives for a woman who has successfully managed a multi-million-dollar business empire and raised 4 children who have all achieved professional success." I turned back to face them, and for the first time in months, I allowed them to see the full force of my anger and disappointment. "What you're proposing isn't family concern, it's financial extortion. You're threatening to have me declared incompetent, not because I lack the ability to manage my affairs but because you don't approve of how I'm choosing to manage them." Rebecca tried to interrupt with protestations about their genuine concern for my welfare, but I continued speaking with the authority of someone who had spent decades making difficult business decisions under pressure. "Let me tell you what I think is really happening here," I said, my voice carrying the steel that had served me well in countless negotiations over the years. "You've all been calculating your inheritance since your father died, and you're worried that my independence threatens your financial security. You see my charitable giving as money stolen from your children's college fund. You view my friendships as relationships that might influence my estate planning in ways that don't benefit you. You're not trying to protect me, you're trying to protect your own financial interests." The expressions on their faces confirmed the accuracy of my assessment. David looked guilty, Michael appeared defensive, Catherine seemed calculating, and Rebecca was clearly preparing a legal counter-argument. None of them looked like loving children who were genuinely concerned about their mother's welfare. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, retrieving an envelope from my desk drawer. "I'm going to save you the trouble of pursuing legal action against me by making a decision that will resolve all your concerns about my financial management." I handed Rebecca the envelope, which contained copies of the key provisions from my new will. "This document explains how my estate will be distributed after my death. I think you'll find that your concerns about my charitable giving and financial decision-making become irrelevant once you understand the actual beneficiaries of my wealth." The silence that filled my apartment as Rebecca read the document aloud was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The expressions on my children's faces shifted from confusion to shock to desperate disbelief as they absorbed the reality that their inheritance had been reduced to $4 total. "This can't be serious," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, you can't actually intend to leave everything to strangers and charities. We're your children. We're your family." His appeal to family loyalty was particularly ironic given that he had spent the past hour threatening to have me declared incompetent if I didn't surrender control of my finances to his oversight. The family connection he was invoking had been notably absent when he was plotting against my independence. "You're absolutely right that you're my children," I replied, "but you stopped being my family the moment you decided that your inheritance was more important than my happiness. Family members don't plot to have each other declared incompetent. Family members don't violate each other's privacy to gather evidence for legal challenges. Family members don't treat love as a transaction that can be withdrawn if the terms become unfavorable. Catherine tried a different approach, appealing to my sense of responsibility toward my grandchildren and future generations. Mom, think about what you're doing to your grandchildren's futures. This money could pay for their educations, help them buy homes, provide security for their family. Are you really going to punish innocent children because of disagreements with their parents? Her attempt to use my grandchildren as emotional leverage was both manipulative and revealing. Catherine was arguing that I owed financial support to grandchildren whose parents had deemed me unfit to manage my own affairs. She wanted me to fund their futures while accepting that I was too incompetent to be trusted with my own present. My grandchildren will receive exactly what their parents have taught them to expect from me, I said. If Rebecca and Michael and David have raised them to value money over relationships, then they'll understand why their inheritance consists of the same $1 their parents will receive. If they've been raised to value character and integrity over financial security, then they'll appreciate that their grandmother chose to use her wealth to help people who actually need it. The conversation that followed was unlike any interaction I had ever had with my children. They cycled through anger, bargaining, denial, and desperate attempts at emotional manipulation as they tried to convince me to change my decision. Rebecca threatened legal challenges to the will's validity. Michael promised to be a more attentive son if I would reconsider my estate plan. Catherine offered to provide ongoing medical care and family support in exchange for restoring their inheritance. David proposed elaborate financial arrangements that would give them access to my wealth while maintaining the illusion that I retained control. None of their arguments addressed the fundamental issue that had led to my decision: their willingness to betray my trust and undermine my independence for financial gain. They were still treating me like a problem to be solved rather than a person who deserved respect and authentic love. The decision is final, I told them as they prepared to leave my apartment. You chose money over family, and now you'll live with the consequences of that choice. I hope someday you'll understand that the greatest inheritance I could leave you is the knowledge that actions have consequences, and that love cannot be bought or extorted. After they left, I sat in my living room watching the sun set over Lake Michigan and feeling a profound sense of peace. The children I had raised and loved were gone, replaced by adults who saw me only as an obstacle to their financial security. But in choosing to disinherit them, I had also chosen to honor the values that Robert and I had tried to instill in them during their childhood: integrity, compassion, and the understanding that character matters more than wealth. The following months brought exactly the legal challenges I had expected. Rebecca filed papers questioning my mental competency and requesting conservatorship proceedings. Michael submitted evidence of my isolated living situation and concerning social relationships. Catherine provided medical opinions about age-related cognitive decline and the need for family oversight. David presented financial analyses, suggesting that my charitable giving and investment choices indicated impaired judgment. But their carefully planned legal strategy encountered an unexpected obstacle: my comprehensive documentation of my mental capacity, financial acumen, and social connection. The medical evaluations I had obtained, the financial records I had maintained, and the testimony from my friends and neighbors painted a picture of an intelligent, capable woman who was managing her affairs with wisdom and prudence. Harrison Blackwood's defense strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Rather than fighting my children's specific allegations, he demonstrated that their entire case was motivated by financial self-interest rather than genuine concern for my wealth. The recordings of their planning sessions that James had provided, the evidence of their unauthorized access to my financial information, and their own admissions about their inheritance expectations, revealed them as the kind of predatory family members that conservatorship laws were designed to protect elderly people from. The judge's ruling was decisive and unambiguous. Not only did she reject their petition for conservatorship, but she also issued a restraining order preventing them from continuing to harass me with frivolous legal challenges. Her written opinion noted that my children's behavior represented exactly the kind of financial exploitation that the court system was committed to preventing. Mrs. Williams, the judge wrote, has demonstrated remarkable clarity of thought, wisdom in financial management, and appropriate social connections for someone her age. The petitioners have failed to present any credible evidence of incompetency or impaired judgment. Indeed, the evidence suggests that Mrs. Williams' decision to limit her children's inheritance reflects sound judgment about their character and values, rather than cognitive decline or undue influence. The legal victory felt less satisfying than I had expected, because it represented the final confirmation that my relationship with my children was irreparable. They had chosen to wage legal war against me rather than examining their own behavior and choices, and even their defeat in court had not prompted any acknowledgement of their mistakes or expressions of genuine remorse. 2 years have passed since I signed the will that disinherited my children, and I can honestly say that these have been among the happiest years of my life. The foundation I established in Robert's memory has already helped dozens of families navigate difficult inheritance disputes, and provided support for elderly people facing financial exploitation by their own relatives. Eleanor and I have become closer than sisters, sharing daily conversations, and supporting each other through the ordinary challenges and joys of aging. Maria graduated from nursing school with honors and now works in the pediatric ward where Catherine once practiced, bringing the same compassion to her patients that Catherine had lost somewhere along the path to professional success. Patricia's community art program has expanded to serve 3 neighborhoods, providing creative outlets for elderly people who have been written off by society and their own family. The library's literacy programs have helped hundreds of adults develop reading skills that will improve their employment prospects and their children's educational opportunities. My children and I have had no contact since the court ruling, and I have learned to find peace in that silence. The grandchildren I barely knew have become adults who make their own choices about relationships and values, and someday they may understand why their grandmother chose to support strangers who appreciated her generosity rather than family members who felt entitled to. The woman who once measured her worth by her children's achievements and her family's happiness has discovered that fulfillment comes from authentic relationships and meaningful contributions to the world rather than from biological connections that lack emotional substance. Kim Williams is no longer defined by her role as a mother or wife, but by her choices as an independent person who refuses to accept mistreatment from anyone, including her own children. My 83rd birthday last month was celebrated with a party that Eleanor organized, attended by dozens of people whose lives have been touched by my friendship, generosity, or support. The laughter and genuine affection that filled my apartment that evening represented everything my children's forced family gatherings had never been: authentic connections between people who chose to be together rather than feeling obligated to perform family love for financial reasons. As I look ahead to whatever years remain to me, I feel grateful for the painful lessons that taught me the difference between genuine love and financial obligation. My children's betrayal freed me to discover relationships based on mutual respect and shared values, rather than blood connections and inheritance expectations. The $200 million that my children assumed would be theirs has instead become a force for protecting other elderly people from the kind of exploitation I experienced, supporting young people who need education and opportunity more than my grandchildren need, trust fund, and creating programs that build authentic community connections, rather than transactional relationships. In choosing to disinherit my children, I didn't just change my will, I reclaimed my life, and that, more than any financial legacy, has been worth everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.